So, hello everybody from all over the world. My name is Mindy. I'm the Donor Engagement Coordinator at the nonprofit Center for Trauma and Embodiment. I'm also honored to be the host and the timer for the next hour. We have a lot to cover and we want to leave some room for some Q&A at the end. So I want to start right away and I'm going to introduce everyone in the panel and panelists. Please feel free to say a little bit about your bio and your involvement with the research project and whatever else you'd like to share. So I'll start with Dr. Ursula Kelly.
Hi, I'm Ursula Kelly. I'm the nurse scientist at the Atlanta VA. I'm an associate professor at Emory. I'm the associate director for the Injury Prevention Center at Emory, and I am a nurse practitioner ×2, and I work in the public safety net hospital in Atlanta called Grady. And in my role on this study is that I'm the principal investigator.
Thank you. And Dr. Melinda Higgins.
Good morning. How is everybody doing? I'm Melinda Higgins. I'm the director of the Biostatistics and Data Core in the Office of Nursing Research at Emory University. And I've been working with Ursula for more than a decade. Just a little bit about myself. My background is actually I've got dual degrees in analytic chemistry and in biostatistics. So I come from more of a bench science area, but I've been working in the School of Nursing for over 15 years and have learned to appreciate everything that goes on in nursing science. So happy to be here.
Thank you. And Stacy Shulman.
Hey y'all, I'm Stacy, and I was I don't know how to call myself, but yeah, I was also. I'm still forming words. I'm not a morning person.
Good morning.
Good morning. I was the trauma sensitive yoga facilitator for this study. And I was there from the very beginning. And my background is in yoga. I'm a 500-hour certified yoga teacher. I actually have probably more than 1,000 hours of training. And my lineage is Kripalu. And yeah, I'm just delighted to be here. So thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Stacy. And Dave Emerson.
Hey, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Dave Emerson. I'm the co-founder and co-director of the Center for Trauma and Embodiment and the co-founder and co-director of this model, TCTSY, that we'll be talking about, that we came together and studied for over a decade.
So before I ask some questions to the panelists, I just wanted to introduce CFTE in terms of this project. So since 2002, the nonprofit CFTE, which is short for Center for Trauma and Embodiment, and their partners have been researching yoga as adjunctive care for complex trauma and PTSD. To date, there have been over 50 research projects of various kinds related to TCTSY, which David mentioned is our trauma-sensitive yoga model. In 2008, we received the first grant given by the NIH to study yoga for trauma. And in December of 2023, the largest, most robust randomized clinical trial of TCTSY was published in JAMA Network Open. This groundbreaking research indicated that TCTSY was as effective as the gold standard of care for United States military veterans, and that people preferred TCTSY to cognitive processing therapy. So this project is our focus for today, and maybe we can put the link to the research article. Exactly, thank you. So my goal here is to have everyone speak a little bit about the story and the data of the research, and then to leave some time for some Q&A. So you're welcome to put your questions in now or save them for later. So I'm going to start with Ursula. So as you were the person who initiated and was at the helm of this huge project, I was wondering if you could share how this started, how you contacted Dave to collaborate, how you got funding, a bit about the framework of this research project, anything you'd like to share as you were sort of part of this, starting this huge project.
So we have a few hours, right? Like right. The day.
Yeah, I'm gonna put the timer on you, Ursula. I'm so sorry.
Well, first of all, thanks to all the participants who are signing on, and those of you who listen to this later. This is really exciting, and thanks for the invitation to be in this forum. So I'm trying to think of the short version. The short test version is when I came to Emory and the Atlanta VA, which occurred at the same time about 14 or 15 years ago. I was new to the VA and new to taking care of veterans, not new to trauma research though. And so I started a clinical practice in the trauma clinic when I came here so that I could learn more about veterans. And I quickly learned about the gold standard for psychotherapy for treating PTSD. Now there's gold standards for medications as well, but psychotherapy is pretty much the gold standard. And even still now, 15 years later, with our latest clinical practice guidelines that were just released a few months ago as well, exposure therapy is still considered first-line treatment. Because my focus has been working with women survivors of gender-based violence, particularly interpersonal violence, so violence at the hands of people they know. What I found in my clinical practice was that very few of my patients would even consider those evidence-based therapies. The few who did not do well. And at that time, again, over a decade ago, we didn't really have any other options. And so it was always it's your choice. We'll never force you to do anything you don't want to do, but you're in a trauma program, this is what we have. And that just felt really awful. And it happened that a colleague at the School of Nursing, whose office was next door, was a yoga practitioner, as was I at the time. And she said, well, why don't you try yoga for PTSD? And I was like, sure, okay, where do I start? And so she knew about Dave and Jen's work, and so she put me in touch with them. So it was a cold call. I think it was literally either a cold call or a cold email. I don't remember. And I am from Boston, and so I planned to meet Dave at my next opportunity when I was traveling, and we took it from there. Just quickly, in terms of the framework for the project, because I think it's really interesting, and it's kind of taken me this long, 14 years, to really develop that fully. Pardon me. So, in order to get funding, and also how I think about my research is it has to make sense. And so really the premise that I started with, and it wasn't my idea, there were a few papers out there about this at the time, it was really from like a psychoneuroimmunologic perspective, which is what you all know as, the body and the brain are connected. And what happens in PTSD, literally, we hypothesize, is directly counteracted by the way yoga works, like yoga in general. And so it has taken me several years to be able to articulate that there's more than one framework here. So there's that framework, and our study includes all kinds of objective measures of those processes so that we can speak to that, like what's the mechanism, how does it work physically? And then also really the framework of TCTSY, which is about complex trauma. And that's the population that I was working with. And that's why it makes sense that they weren't really doing well with the evidence-based therapies that are out there that can be really effective for certain populations of veterans with certain types of trauma. So that's how it started.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And so to pass the baton to Melinda, your role on the study as a biostatistician was to primarily coordinate with the research coordinators on reviewing the data and the final data analysis. Can you share more about the study design, your discoveries, and if there's some time, perhaps the statistical equivalence test you also performed?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so like I mentioned, I've been working with Ursula for the last decade plus. And so my role as a statistician, honestly, a lot of times is just to come to the table and be quiet and listen and learn. because part of what I need to do is understand the source of the data, some of the underlying like mechanisms of how people are responding to certain questionnaires, some of the underlying mechanisms of like biomarkers that we may be measuring, things like that. So I spend a lot of time trying to like understand the patterns in the data, why we're seeing certain things and so forth. So like, for example, one of the questions related to sort of looking at the data quality and things like that, a lot of times I'll sit down and look at, look for missing data, look for unusual outliers, things of that sort. And for me, with trauma population, I wasn't as attuned to some of the responses that, say, the clinical team was definitely used to. Case in point, like really high scores on things for depression or anxiety. I'm usually measuring or looking at those measurements in other sort of chronic disease populations, not so much in a trauma population. And so some of the questions that I had were, why are some of these scores, these seem really high? And they're like, yeah, well, that's because, and they would explain. And I was like, oh, okay. So I'm beginning to sort of understand why the distributions look the way they look. And one of the questions that I did have with the clinical team was I began noticing there were several items that were continuously skipped or missed on some of the sleep quality questionnaires that we used. And what was interesting to me was it wasn't that they were just skipping the whole questionnaire, but there were certain questions that they weren't answering. And so I went back and I was like, is there any way for us to find this out? Was it just an error? Oops, I missed question 3 kind of thing. But it turned out on some of the sleep quality questionnaires, they asked things like, what time do you consistently like go to bed? What time do you wake up? And those kinds of questions, for some people, they can't answer because they don't know. Some of the stories that I know, and a few that just literally broke my heart, were some of these women were just so terrified to go to sleep because they had been attacked previously when they fell asleep. And so they really had no idea. They didn't have a consistent sleep wake schedule, things like that. So I think sometimes for those of you that are working, try to engage your statistician, because I tell people all the time, missing data is data, right?
Mm.
Like sometimes there's a reason, there's a underlying mechanism for that. And so understanding that can then help later on with some of the analysis. And relative to the way the study was originally designed, it was designed as a classic sort of randomized control trial where we had, the gold standard for CPT compared to a new therapy. And so we went in designing with the classic sort of inequality testing where what you want to do is group A different than group B? And so we followed all of that protocol and setting up the study, powering it, and so forth. And what we began to find was both groups were improving on a lot of measures. And the bonus with the yoga therapy was there was much higher engagement, the attrition was less, and so forth. So I thought that was an amazing finding in and of itself. And the other thing we noticed too was for yoga on a few of the outcomes, and I encourage you to take a look at the paper, but there was some immediate response, immediate improvement. And then for the people that were in CPT, sometimes it would lag just a little bit. For people that stayed in and did the complete CPT, they also had really good outcomes. So don't get me wrong, but the engagement was much less, and we had a massive amount of drop off really after baseline. And so I mentioned to Ursula, I was like, well, maybe what we do is go back, because what we wanted to say was they're equivalent. And I'm like, well, we can't really say that like from a statistical standpoint, but I can go back and run equivalence testing. And all that really says is, instead of trying to test, is group A different than group B? You sort of flip the hypothesis, and what you're trying to test is you're trying to say, I don't have enough evidence to say that group A and group B are any different. And so you set up kind of this margin of equivalence, and then you look to see, are they different or not within this margin? And what we found was they weren't. Like for most of the key outcomes, and at least in the initial part of the study, that you get equivalent results pretty quickly. So yeah, it's been fun. I've learned a ton. Anyhow, thank you. So, and I think Ursula may have had a comment.
Oh, I just wanted to tag on to that because before we move on to Stacy and Dave, because this is the thing, this is what keeps me awake at night, is I talked about, the VA is a leader in PTSD treatment, absolutely, hands down. And there are evidence-based treatments. How we determine evidence of effectiveness is by how much people improve. Not in that equation is how many people drop out, how many people don't do this thing at all. And so, sort of what Melinda was saying is, yeah, there wasn't really any difference. And of course, I secretly wanted there to be like a dramatic difference in effectiveness, but to have this treatment be just as effective as the best we have, but more acceptable, meaning more people completed the treatment. And in VA populations, the actual percentage of those patients who are referred for PTSD treatment, the actual percentage of those who go to the intake appointment, then start the therapy, if it's an exposure therapy, complete that therapy, and get better so that they no longer have PTSD is really minuscule. And so really what this is not to offer or put forward TCTSY as something that's better than, but like any complex problem, PTSD, most people have more than one trauma. Like once you have one major trauma, you're likely to have another. It's a complex problem. And so the more options that we have, the better. And so what we've learned in, the study that was published in December that was the big one. That was preceded by 2 baby pilots and 1 little experiment just as a clinical thing in that setting, right? So we started this actually in fall of 2012. That's when Stacy started. So I just wanted to point out, when we talk about effectiveness and what works, that's how much your scores change on a measure from here to there. And that doesn't really include how do you feel about that treatment? How, can you complete it? And if nothing else, I think TCTSY offers a way to engage women into care in the VA, particularly women who experienced military sexual trauma, because that's just about the last place they want to be if it's not a welcoming environment. And so really what we're trying to do here is have something that people will try. And if it's effective, fantastic. And if it's not completely, or it's just not a fit, then maybe exposure therapy is, and that's fine too. So we're just looking to expand our options.
Exactly. And that's such a nice segue, Ursula, to Dave when it comes to options and choice making. So I was wondering, Dave, perhaps kind of pulling it back just to seeing some of the questions, and just for some of us who are watching this live or on replay, we're talking about TCTSY, we're talking about yoga, and if you could briefly explain a little bit what TCTSY is about, in terms of this 20 plus years of research and development, and then anything else you'd like to add about the research project in general.
Absolutely. I'm kind of recalling like a couple of winter days in 2010, 2011, when Ursula, Stacy, and another yoga facilitator, Holly Black, came up to Boston, and we kind of got in the room together for a couple of days and I had the opportunity to begin to share our model with them. So my role overarching in the project has been around the efficacy of the model, so TCTSY. And what that is, it stands for trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga, in case that's unfamiliar to anybody here. Lots of words. It's a model based in yoga theory, trauma theory, neuroscience, attachment theory, relationships, made specifically for people with complex trauma. And our framework there is interrelational power dynamics. So we're really considering a person, in this case, in the context of relationships. So when Ursula was making that distinction, I found that very interesting at the beginning. She was talking a little bit about mechanisms for yoga, right, related to PTSD. I wonder if we can talk more about that. And then this specific model, which is a treatment for complex trauma. So we're really considering both in this case, right? Like we're looking at PTSD symptoms and symptom change, as Ursula, as we were saying, but also like, what is it like to, experience interrelational trauma and to engage in healing from that perspective? So this specific model, let me know if I'm getting to your question, Mindy, but is really, we're thinking about that mostly, right? So that means from a relational perspective, like me and Stacy and Holly and the other facilitators, we're meeting all the time for this whole process. We are meeting very regularly. We're discussing the process as it's unfolding. Stacy, as the facilitator in the room, is showing up with a specific kind of skill set related to TCTSY, but also really fundamentally with this mentality that the relationship is at the center of what's happening. Right, so Stacy is engaging, not just thinking about the outcome on a PTSD scale, really, but as this relationship is unfolding, and what is a healing relationship, right? Is sort of counter to the dynamics of trauma, relationships that are manipulative, oppressive, and abusive. So, on a big picture level, that's how I think about it. And my role here was to, really support Stacy as she's unfolding this in real time. And the other thing I would just say broadly is when we first met, we hadn't started our TCTSY certification program until 2013. So we kind of did our own, we piloted that too. Like up until then, we had been working on this for, like 12, 13 years, doing trainings, like sharing the information as we're learning it over time. This was the first time we really got to sort of hand the baton to somebody and say, okay, you can put this into practice, and we'll support you in that process. So really exciting for us too, organizationally.
Thanks so much, Dave. Before I ask Stacey a question, I do want to say that Dr. Bel Zakari, who is a psychologist at the Portland VA Medical Center, was supposed to be on the panel, but she unfortunately wasn't able to attend. So I do want to acknowledge that. And we're getting so many good questions in the chat, and so I'm really going to be a good timer, I promise. So, Stacey, segueing from Dave talking about TCTSY, you were the main TCTSY facilitator. You did all the sessions in Atlanta for, I believe, 6 to 7 years. Please correct me if I have that wrong. And then you mentored the facilitators who did sessions in Portland. I'm opening this up to you about sharing your experience of being part of this, being part of, the beautiful thing about TCTSY is the relational aspect. So you were there in your body on that lived experience with others who were exploring in their own pace and time, their own sensations in their own body. So you have a particular, experience that may be a little different from others on the panel. So I wanted to open that up for you.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for acknowledging that. And first and foremost, I just have to say, I can't express enough gratitude for Ursula and for Dave and for everyone, on the team. This was an extraordinary experience. And the word that comes to mind really is how tender this experience was. We would walk in, there was always another person with me, right? There was always another woman with me. And we would walk into the room, and the tension that we would feel in the beginning session, we have these women looking at us, kind of side eye, right? What are you going to do for me? Right? What is this going to do for me? And by the end of the session, the relationships that we built were amazing. And they were built because we were sharing experience. We were sharing this direct experience. And we had to say things like, we're sorry, we can't be friends with you. We can't, when we come in, we can't ask you how your day was. We can't, we can't really get to know you. And that was a really hard part, but we got to know people based on this shared, for me, sacred experience, even as sterile as it could be, right? Because we're in an office building, or we're in the VA, right? We're on Formica, not Formica, but we're on, tile floors, so yeah, at times it felt really sterile, but we were still able to energetically connect with people, and it was absolutely phenomenal. And to be able to work, what I felt like was workshop it almost, every week to every 2 weeks, was really, really helpful in terms of my understanding what we were doing, and in terms of my even bettering my delivery, right? Because it changes over time. As we learned the protocol, it changed over time. And it heightened my observation skills, because I had to. I was, frontline observation. And so there's so much that so many benefits that enough about everyone else. It's all about me, right? But but really, what I received from this was just, so enriching. And the feedback that we would get from the participants when they would say things like, especially towards the end of the series, you've given me back my relationship with my husband. You've given me back my relationship with my children. What else could we do? Right? We improved someone's quality of life. And that was really, that felt really important. This work is really important. And yeah, there was one other thing I was going to say, and it just left my mind. So we'll leave it at that. But yes, this work feels very, very important, and very, very tender. And I feel so grateful to have been able to have been a part of it. Oh, when we would hear about things like outcomes, right? We would hear outcomes. That would just make us even more excited, right? We would get an outcome and it was like, yeah, wow, that's super cool, So that was even more exciting, was to be able to hear how the numbers were working out. That was even more exciting too. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Stacy. And Dave, did you want to say something?
Just real quick, I was just looking, I have a folder of all the notes. So part of this process was Stacy and Holly would take notes during the sessions, and we'd use those as our conversations. And I just found the first one I have is from April 2014. So Ursula, was that a pilot phase that was prior to the actual study? So almost 10 years ago, the first note is here, which is, just want to share that, Stacy. Like, it's trying to sum up like what you've done over all this process, and what we've all done together is kind of it's touching.
Yeah, that's incredible. And just for curiosity's sake, when you are, the amount of time of the actual study, the amount of sessions for each cohort, can someone mention that?
Sure, I will, and then Stacy and Dave, you can make any corrections. So, and I'll sort of weave in answers to some of the questions I'm seeing in the chat. And so, I am not a yoga teacher nor a TCTSY facilitator, and so the protocol that we're talking about is the protocol that Dave and Jen had set up. So this wasn't something we even felt like we needed to, quote, adapt to our population. It is what it is. Our population in Atlanta is primarily African American. When we added the Portland site at the tail end of this most recent study, that population was like 97% white, I think. But in Atlanta, it's primarily an African American population. We didn't do anything to adapt it. I did some focus groups and some interviews and some things before we even started to see if it would fly at all, with not just our patients, but with clinicians in the program, and everyone was up for it. So the protocol as written, because of course this is a science thing, is we started by saying 60 to 75-minute sessions, or we started with 75-minute sessions once a week for 10 weeks. So the protocol has always been 10 sessions weekly, but we're clear now that it ended up being more like 60 minutes, and the initial sessions would be even less because it builds on itself. And so it ended up being more in the 40 to 60-minute range. And that's the other thing, comparing that to the psychotherapy option. So both were protocol driven. So we used, the TCTSY protocol, and we used the CPT protocol, which is 90-minute sessions once a week for 12 weeks, co-led by 2 psychotherapists.
Thank you so much. Thanks. And sort of the last question, there's so many good questions in the chat. So I really do want to get to those. I want to acknowledge reading them. But you did mention Portland. So sort of there was always going to be some cohorts in Portland, I believe. And then you all were definitely thrown a curveball with the pandemic. And all the sessions had to move online. And I was just wondering, just opening this up for anybody, can you share more about that experience? And did it affect the data? Melinda, maybe if you wanted to add that in, like, how did that show up? Yeah.
So I'll just address that briefly and then leave it to everyone else to fill in. So we added Portland. Actually, Portland wasn't, the original study was intended to be a single site. And what we found is we had a lot of difficulty, more than I expected, recruiting for the study. And my hypothesis about that is that people had to agree to be randomized to either the yoga intervention or cognitive processing therapy. And so it's counterintuitive in a way to do a randomized control trial using a treatment that, as an investigator and as a clinician and as a human, I knew my patients didn't want. And so we did have more difficulty recruiting than we expected. And so we needed to add another site. I had kind of worked through everybody possible in Atlanta because we did 2 pilots before this study that we're talking about. And even before that, we did a little experiment. So then with COVID, yeah. So, the VA is the largest healthcare system in the country. And though it is a network of healthcare systems, every VA has its own ways of operating. And so one of the biggest challenges, even with COVID, was the rules in Atlanta were not the same as the rules in Portland. I mean, Portland was near Seattle. I mean, right in the very beginning, there were just different dynamics happening. And so we had to, our session, one of the weeks in March, was canceled with 2 hours notice, Like I got a blast email from VA saying no patient contact allowed as of 2 o'clock this afternoon. And so we changed everything to virtual delivery within 2 weeks. And so thanks to Stacy and Dave for figuring out how are we going to do this and in VA maintain privacy. So, you know, our Stacy was facilitating to a screen of names because we weren't having people show their video for privacy, all those things. Psychotherapy went virtual, data collection did, including shipping EKG machines to people's houses, all kinds of things. And so Belle Zakari was involved in that. Terry Haywood was our project manager at that time, and she's really the person who figured it all out and led it all and taught us how to get approvals for everything we needed to get. We went ahead and used Zoom, even though we weren't sure that was kosher, but we did. Oh, this meeting is being recorded. So it absolutely was a team effort. Terry gets so much credit in my book for figuring out how to make these changes in 2 different VAs, while really acknowledging how disruptive COVID was to our participants and to our patient populations just tremendously.
Yeah.
And so I'll let everyone else jump in on the rest of it.
The only thing that I would add was we knew going in that the 2 sites were different for lots of reasons. I mean, COVID was a piece of that, but different patient populations, different organization, and so forth. Having said that, from a statistical perspective, we have run sensitivity analysis and looked at the data with and without Portland. In Portland, we only had about 20 or so participants. So the sample size in Portland really wasn't enough for us to really fully understand the impact of perhaps the differences in the patients or perhaps the differences in the virtual versus in person and so forth. Having said that, even in Atlanta, we did look at the data pre and post COVID, because I think there was and I'm trying to remember exactly, it's been a while. I think there was one cohort at the end that ended up going virtual because of COVID, and we ran the data with and without that cohort. Anyway, bottom line was our conclusions were consistent across the board. So we did do a sensitivity analysis looking at some of these effects, since we didn't have the sample sizes large enough to fully understand the COVID effect, I can't tell you that. But in terms of the overall broad conclusions, we did look to see if that would have an impact on our results, and it didn't. So, anyway.
Thanks so much, Melinda. Does anybody else want to say anything before I'm going to move on to another section? And
Just real quick, Minnie, I know we had a lot of great questions in the chat, but from a facilitation standpoint, I know that was really interesting conversations there for facilitators, and we got to learn that the data seemed to be relatively consistent online versus in person, like Melinda was saying. But for the facilitators in Portland that were working online, their satisfaction was lower in the conversations we had, and I think that's just worth noting. I don't know if Stacy wants to say anything about that, but the way you describe being in person, and the sort of the vibrancy there, I think was missing. If that's how I felt about it, right? For the facilitator and the facilitator's experience in this model in particular, it matters because it's relational. It was a learning piece of learning for us. Although I would say, just anecdotally, I know facilitators who do work online who actually are very satisfied. So I wouldn't want to say that's a blanket issue at all, but I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Stacy.
Sure, I'm happy to. Being in the middle of it and having to switch gears so quickly, from being in person to being online, I can absolutely see where the satisfaction would be a lot lower. For me, it was definitely a different experience. And it took a lot of practice, you know, and just continuing to, you know, it took a lot of practice to continue to be able to reach out, you know. And so, yeah, I can see that there's benefits to being online. I know that I have clients that prefer it. I myself prefer being in person. It's just the kind of person and the kind of facilitator that I am. So yeah, I think that there's benefits to being online, but I think that there's also issues to being online. You know, there's a certain level of objectification that comes from having to observe someone via a screen, you know, and I think that that's a really important piece to consider when you think about working with people online.
Thank you so much, Stacey. Yeah, we could have a whole roundtable about that, I think. So I'm going to, as timer and all these questions, I'm just going to shift gears just a little bit. And I wanted to, before opening it up to some questions and for the panelists and honoring some questions in the group, I do want to say and be transparent, right? Besides having the honor of being the host today, I am also the donor engagement coordinator. And so as a nonprofit, being able to do robust research, train folks around the world, have a strong scholarship program, sustain global missions, we do rely on grants, foundations, and donors. So if it is feasible, I'm sharing our link here. Stefan, if you can, that would be great, to our giving page. If giving funds is not available, there are so many other ways to give. You'll get the recording in the next day or two, and so please share with your network. If you know of an organization, media, any source of collaboration in getting our message out, we would be so grateful. Everyone here, this is about relationships and being in relationship, and I so look forward to having conversations with you, any suggestions, any feedback. So if you can also put my email here in the chat as well, I look forward to any conversations. Quickly, we're also having our incredible yearly online international conference, which will also talk about research. More information about that, we'll put a link in. And also, please be on the lookout. We're going to continue doing these roundtable discussions. And if there's any interest, we do have a YouTube channel where are links to some past roundtable discussions. So we're going to put that in the chat as well. I'll get those things in the chat in a moment. So for the panelists, I do want to sort of have this, and you can weave this in, but I do want to, there's so many questions as well. So I'm gonna go back to some of the questions, and also kind of like what's next, right? What's exciting about this? What does the data show? I mean, I've noticed that when you go on to JAMA Open Network, we're in the top 5% of all research outputs ever tracked by alt metrics. So it's like evidence that like people are interested in these findings. People are reading this, they're interested in this research. So I would love to hear like kind of what's next. I do want to also acknowledge a question. My apologies, they scrolled down really fast for me, but one stood out, and I want to acknowledge this, right? Jacqueline had asked the question, were these clinicians and yoga teachers researchers from BIPOC communities? If yes or no, do you discuss how this might affect research outcomes? So I think that's an incredibly important question, and I was wondering if anyone would like to answer that.
Yes, I'd be happy to. And wow, I haven't been looking on JAMA Open, so my mind's a little blown right now. And I'm going to say I think that's thanks to like the global TCTSY community. we have a lot of fans, so just keep clicking. So Jacqueline or Elle, thank you so much for your question and your sort of your series of comments. I really appreciate that. And I'm being thrown back in time because I am from New England and had just come to the South when I took this job, and so definitely I was living in a very different environment than I was used to, and at a different time, even now. So this was 14 or 15 years ago. The short version, the direct answer to your question is, among the investigators on the research team, most of us are white. You know, there's some we have one investigator from Eastern Europe, one from, you know, of Indian descent, but no African American or Black investigators. I made every effort to have the staff on the team who would be interacting directly with the participants and doing recruitment and enrollment and data collection and reminders. I would say off the top of my head was probably 75% Black and African American women, including Terry, who was also a veteran. So the other thing that was important to me was to have a veteran perspective. And Terry brought that toward the end of the project. The therapists who provided the CPT were pretty consistent. But among the transitions, I would say probably 80% of the sessions were delivered by 2 African American women, one of whom was also a yoga teacher, and I really was trying to get her to come over to the other side, but she wasn't available to do that. So we didn't adapt. We didn't adapt the intervention, but I did change some of the measurements that we included in the study based on feedback, based on race and ethnic backgrounds that differed from the people who devised those instruments. And we collected a lot of qualitative data as well, where we asked these questions, like, what is this, you know, what is this like? And does it matter? And honestly, it was one of my biggest concerns was making sure that this wasn't a mismatch somehow. And everything that I can tell from the qualitative data tells me that that didn't matter to our participants.
I can add to, you know, walking into the room, you know, 2 white women, you know, kind of walking into this room or you know, and having an audience of primarily African American and Black women, I think that sometimes added to the tension a little bit, you know, in the beginning. You know, what are these white ladies going to do for me, right? It really, I know I had to, and I know that my co-facilitators also had to really examine our place and our privilege and where we were coming from. And again, I think that is what built that deep relationship. You know, I think that was what built that sense of tenderness, is that we were just, I don't want to say that we were careful, but we certainly had to be aware. You know, there was a certain level of awareness that we had to have. And I think it was really, again, just so amazing that we could, that this modality could cross all of those barriers, because there were a lot of barriers. And it would be easy to make a lot of assumptions, for us to have made a lot of assumptions as we were observing. And we didn't, you know, we left, you know, we didn't add those opinions or those references to the observations. We really saw people from that really deep place, and not an external place or a place, you know, we didn't make assumptions about people.
Thank you so much, Stacey.
It's real quick, just from a broad perspective, it's so important that we talk about this, and we all continue to talk about intersectional identity in the context of trauma and trauma care. So I'm so glad this is part of our conversation here. one of the things I'm thinking about too is like the first randomized controlled trial with TCTSY was published in 2014, started in about 2008. And that cohort was about 75% white identifying and female identifying. So Ursula and Melinda, correct me if I'm wrong, but just demographically speaking, my understanding is most PTSD studies are participants identify as white in general. Is that fair to say? So for us as a team, what does that mean structurally? If we're putting it into context, who are these treatments for? Who feels welcome? Part of that has to do with who is involved in the research from every aspect, facilitation, but also participation. So having this cohort identifying at about 95 or 90% Black and African American is a contribution to note, in the sense that we want to be paying attention to that too, right? Like yoga can be, in the Western context, can be very exclusionary in terms of intersectional identity. Psychotherapy, right? Mental health care in general, who feels safe and welcome. So adding this to the conversation as well, like the biggest study with TCTSY, I think that is, just want to note that as well as part of the whole picture.
Thanks, Dave. I know I'm not getting to a lot of questions here. So if any of the panelists see something that they want to answer, but I do want to, looking at time, also come back to that kind of what's next, what's exciting, what other research, could come next, all these things.
Such a great question. I'll just comment, I know we're running out of time. I said we need all day. I want to just follow up on Dave's comment. So it turns out all of the research I've ever done in my career, this and before this phase, has been with populations who are not white and but have been traumatized. And my short answer is not in any way to dismiss the importance of recognizing, acknowledging, seeing all of those things, the differences that we have among demographics and race and ethnicity are huge considerations, right? My experience has been that what women who have been traumatized look for is someone who recognizes that they have that there's a shared experience along that dimension, and that dimension may be more important for establishing a sense of comfort and safety than what we look like. That is not to say that on the who you see, you don't know their experience. And so that takes longer sort of to know that there's a recognition in the room that we have this shared experience. But that would be another great roundtable, actually. That would be amazing. So next up is we have done an additional study at Grady, which is the safety net hospital in Atlanta. And someone, I think Catherine, somebody asked a question early on, are we using this with other studies with interpersonal trauma? And so the Grady study that we did was a pilot to demonstrate feasibility so we can do the next thing there. Again, that population is primarily African-American. Our inclusion there was that someone had experienced a sexual trauma in their lifetime and that they had our threshold for PTSD symptoms, so traumatic stress symptoms, not the diagnosis, was pretty low because I'm not really interested, I don't care about the diagnosis. So that study is done. We're analyzing the data now. We also have a lot of qualitative data on that. I am working on, I have a design for the next study. I was not able to get it funded in the first round. But the next study, just between you and me, like all 300 of us, includes a component of not a straight randomized controlled trial, but an adapted randomized controlled trial where individuals get to make a choice if they have a preference, which is, frankly, just brilliant. And I'm not the person who thought of it. So I think that's where we'll really learn, because this is a behavioral intervention. What people want to do, what they're looking for, what they can buy into matters in behavioral interventions in a way that it doesn't with, for example, pharmaceutical interventions. And so I actually think that next study, when we get it funded and up and running, will teach us so much more than what we've learned in this study, which is tremendous already.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Melinda, I saw your hand.
Oh, well, I know we're almost out of time. The only thought I had, and Ursula and I have talked about this for years, is that, we see effectiveness in both arms. And I keep saying it's not really A or B. To me, it feels like if yoga is the way to engage someone and get them engaged in therapy, right? And then once they're engaged, see if you can get them into CPT or something else, which is exactly what Ursula was talking about with this new adaptive trial. So, because I would love to see the effectiveness be awesome for everyone so that, they're not just dropping out. Anyway.
Yeah. And I know that there were, we have 1 minute, I'm going to take it, that there were some questions, if there have been studies with those identifying as male, other populations. I wonder if anybody. Yes.
Real quick, there's
Yeah.
one TCTSY study also from Atlanta with youth in the Department of Juvenile Justice. You can find it on the website, traumasensitiveyoga.com. And that was adapting TCTSY for male identifying youth.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else that is calling out to anybody here? As the time ticks, thank you all so much. Thank you especially to the panelists for your, I don't know, as someone who only reads research and doesn't do them, if the length of time for this research is common or your patience and persistence of this amount of time is different and unusual. But we so appreciate the amount of time, effort that you all have done in putting this out there and what it means ultimately for each person, right? And their experience and their options in their own body. So I want to thank everybody who is attending. Please reach out. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you all so much. If anybody wants to say anything as we leave.
Thanks, Minnie.
Thanks so
See
much.
y'all.
Thank you, everybody. See you at the next roundtable.